I always find it helpful when I'm discussing a paper for the author's benefit to just kind of give my own background of where I'm coming from, because you'll have a better sense of what is motivating my remarks. So SSGA, I work for State Street Global Advisors. We're a very large asset manager of a lot of different types of strategies, so index, active, across all asset classes. And I actually am a research head for the index side on the equity side. So have been working with a lot of asset owners, including pension funds, over the last 10 years now around how they're incorporating ESG, but certainly am not and have not worked for a pension fund directly. So first of all, I thought the paper, Judith and Stephanie, it was really fantastic in sort of capturing the state of the state right now and how pension funds are thinking. Certainly PSP is well known for being a vanguard in the space. Just to summarize the paper again, I know you recently just presented it, but for the audience's benefit, I know that I always kind of need to be reminded. There's this feeling in the industry that on the face of it, ESG's relevance should be almost like a no-brainer for pension funds because they have very long horizons and they are viewed as intergenerational stewards of capital. But when we sort of see what pension funds are actually doing in the world, you see a lot of them sort of being very hesitant, and that's because there is this very important potential tension with their fiduciary duty, and a lot of that is because ESG return and risk is so hard to quantify. Right, we're in such early days yet. So the paper reviews the historical and structural characteristics of pension funds. Sort of attempts to pinpoint what are the enablers and inhibitors, and pinpoints 5 characteristics, which Judith went through. Now, what I thought, just sort of my take on the paper, is that it's very good in reflecting the actual practical and real life challenges that pensions face. It definitely raises awareness of the tension between characteristics that favor the consideration of ESG, such as that long-term horizon versus fiduciary responsibility. When we look at why we don't see the pace of ESG assets keeping up with the amount of media attention, for instance, that ESG is getting, and certainly in the financial research space, a lot of that is because of that reason. I thought the paper was good in highlighting differences in countries, and the important role of government and regulatory authority. So certainly the climate in Canada and the UK has been much more favorable to ESG, pension funds adopting and integrating ESG over the last 4 years, which really pinpoints how politicized ESG has been, right, in certain countries like the US. I think the paper makes very important points about why these sort of 3, we'll call them buckets of discussion, that are also going on out there: pensions as universal owners, the role pensions play between public interest and private markets, and their unique legal structure. How those 3 things sort of all feed into the actual adoption of ESG by pension funds. And I did like the PSP case study, Stephanie. So it was really nice to get your perspective there. So some suggestions to consider. I know. So I create, in sort of thinking about the paper, I did not really find anything. I didn't find anything that I would recommend in improving the paper per se, but I did have some thoughts around just sort of the general challenges of the issues you've raised in the paper. And you've acknowledged this, that data definitions and disclosures are still sort of the major obstacle. One thing that I kept thinking about while I was reading the PSP case study is that, PSP is definitely very much reflective of where a lot of the most sophisticated and vanguard of ESG leading asset owners are. And the main obstacle that you all have and others is, how do you actually define ESG, right? And how do you determine what is financially material? We have been big proponents of frameworks like SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, because they've been very prescriptive about what is financially material. And then when you layer on something like climate, it makes it even more confusing, because are we talking about climate? Or are we talking about sort of more of a best-in-class notion of ESG? And if we're talking about the latter, which framework are we using? Are we using SASB? Are we using a proprietary one developed by one of the vendors? And that does have significant implications for the actual execution of an ESG program, because what is success, right? I mean, even within our own book of business, and we are, one of the largest asset managers in the world, our biggest challenge right now is figuring out how to report ESG. And so, certainly as an asset owner, reporting is key for you as well, but manager selection and monitoring, right? You're going to have to quantify ESG in some way. The other thing that I was thinking of was that you mentioned engagement in your paper a few times, but don't spend a lot of time in engagement. I know Laura's paper actually spends, she has a whole paper on engagement, but one thing I would probably think about adding to the paper is just the notion of how stewardship programs could play a role in this whole ecosystem. They are evolving very quickly and very becoming much more nuanced. So, all the big asset managers are, building out their stewardship team, adding, two, three times the amount of people that they used to have on it. And the definition of activism is also evolving with that. Okay, I'm going to move on to Laura's paper with Zach. Laura, always great to read your research. I've been a fan of your research for, many decades now. Like your paper, it's a great synthesis of the research that you've done. I wanted to make sure that, those who hadn't read the paper realize that the paper really is sort of bringing together all of the latest research. And you cite some extant research from others, but, really you have three key papers, which you go into a lot of detail on. They're listed here. So your 2020 paper, which is around the survey that you discussed, the paper that you wrote on the option pricing paper about climate policy. That was really interesting, by the way. And then the last one here that you wrote with Andreas Hoppner and a bunch of other co-authors around whether engagement on climate issues reduces downside risk. I thought that was really interesting too. And so you kind of make the argument both directly and indirectly that climate risks should be important to pension funds. So the contribution to literature, because I know, I'm not sure if the attendees have read this paper. I thought it would be worth highlighting some of the key findings from these papers. The Kruger, Sautner, and Starks paper that you've written, that is a survey of 439 institutional investors. Found it very interesting in that respondents generally think that that climate risks are important, and it's already started to materialize, right? And most of them have already taken those first steps towards managing climate risk. And I also found it, like some of the factoids you had in there, like divestment being the least frequently used approach is really interesting, because it shows a very significant shift, I think, in the way institutional investors are approaching climate over the last 5 years. I think there's been kind of a sea change. And then your last point about whether or not equity valuations fully reflect the risk. I mean, that is a question that sort of everyone is asking, right? Because that has real ramifications for active management and for risk management. So, and then the other two papers, I know in the interest of time, I'll go through these quickly. Thought the option pricing paper was really interesting. That's a very thorough empirical piece looking at option prices for S&P 500 constituents over a fairly long period. And we find a statistically significant link between carbon intensity and downside tail risk. And then the other paper was really focused on engagement. And there, you test basically whether or not engagement can actually impact downside risk. And I thought it was really interesting that your main findings were around the fact that general engagement doesn't really matter as much, but getting to certain milestones. So getting to, you define milestones in that paper, the milestone 2 being acknowledgement by the management of the company that there is an ESG issue. Milestone 3 being where the target management has started to take action. And the further along in terms of milestones you get, the more of an impact these climate risk issues impact downside risk. So as a standalone piece, I thought it was nice in bringing everything together. I think if you wanted to sort of further expand this as a standalone piece and have it live on its own, it could benefit from just a few mentions, I think. So, and sort of thinking more in terms of, one paragraph for, each of these things, but some of the regulatory risk and recent developments in Europe, SFDR in Europe, and in the US, the recent SEC focus, the impact of voluntary initiatives such as TCFD's disclosure, and then all the net zero alliances, both the asset owner and asset manager alliances that have recently come into being. Stranded asset risk, that's a tough one because I feel like that's one that a lot of the industry right now we're trying to face. And then pricing transition and physical risk. I think you allude to those in your paper, but that's becoming sort of the norm, and sort of thinking about the link between transition and physical risk and pricing. And because you talk about all of these issues so much, I think mentioning that and how that might link to downside risk would be really great. And then acknowledgement, of course, of the data history gaps and the limitations of empirical analysis whenever we're dealing with anything related to ESG. So thank you, Laura, for letting me review your paper. Thank you, Stephanie and Judith. It was a great honor and privilege.